Hey there, I'm Patrick from YogaRenew Teacher Training, and in this video I'm going to talk a little bit about this hot topic of whether or not to use your notes while you're teaching a yoga class. First and foremost, I want to say that teachers on both sides of this issue are amazing. There are teachers that use notes in all of their classes and it works out great, and there are teachers that don't use notes in their classes and it also works out amazing. However, this video specifically is going to talk about if you're thinking about ditching your notes. I'm going to give you a few tips to give you the confidence that you do have the ability to put those notes aside and still teach a class that is creative, is diverse, and is interesting for your students on any given day. I also want to say that I do use my notes in the beginning of class to set an intention, to read a quote, to give an important piece of yoga philosophy that I couldn't remember word for word. So I write all those things down in my notebook. I open my notebook up in the beginning of class. I read that powerful message or that quote, and then I close my notebook to get class started. Secondly, I've written down every class sequence that I've ever taught in my notebook just like this for the last 17 years. In fact, I have boxes and boxes and boxes of notebooks at home of all the classes and all the poses and all the things I've thought about around teaching yoga for all the years I've been teaching. I feel that being prepared and writing down all my thoughts before I actually teach is the best way for me to be creative and teach in the moment and be dynamic and interactive if my plan has to change. So, the reason that I decided to ditch my notes while teaching my actual sequence is because no matter what I wrote in this book, I started to realize that students weren't always going to follow that prescription on any given day. And that was because I had injuries in class. There were students that maybe showed up that weren't the right level for that specific class. They also maybe didn't have the same energy that matched the class that I created. There are lots of different variables when you go in and teach a class on a day that would also make you change the class that you have written down for that day. So I felt that the more I put my notes aside, the more dynamic I could be in changing my plan on the fly. I just also want to say though, being prepared and being well-versed in all of my class plans beforehand helped me be creative on the fly when I needed to change those things. So let's go through a few tips to give you the confidence to ditch those notes if you are thinking about it. Number one is that if you've done a yoga teacher training, which I'm assuming you have because you're out there teaching yoga, then you know the general class structure of how a yoga class kind of lays out, the ebbs and flows of a class. You know that it starts with a warm-up, you know the poses that go in a warm-up, you know sun salutations could come next, standing poses, you know all the standing poses, maybe you have arm balances and inversions, back bends, forward folds, and a cool down. So you know the general structure of a class. And if you forget a specific pose that you wrote down in your sequence, my experience has been that it's okay. If I know the general structure of class, I understand what could come next in that sequence and then deliver something on the fly that's responsive to what I'm seeing in the room at that moment. So you can do it, you know the general structure of a class, and you know what would come next in a sequence if you don't remember exactly what you wrote down in your notebook before class. The second tip I want to point out is that students don't necessarily need to know, they don't remember if you missed the pose that you wrote down in your notebook. I've never had a student come up to me after class and say, "Oh my God, Patrick, that specific transition that you did in the second round of standing poses from triangle to half moon to downward facing dog was really, really amazing. That was the turning point for me in the class." They only ask themselves one question after class. Did the class make me feel good or did it not make me feel good? And my experience has been that if I'm teaching interactively based on what's happening in the room, even if I forgot what pose I wrote down that was coming next and I delivered something else, it always worked out. My presence in the room and my ability to move on the fly made the class seamlessly move forward and effortlessly move forward. So you have that ability to understand that your students don't know what's coming next. You have the ability to create what's coming next based on what's happening in the moment. The last thing I want to point out is that I find teaching to be more interesting when it's interactive and dynamic. Of course, like I said in the beginning, I'm well prepared. I plan out every detail of my class beforehand. And that amount of planning and detail beforehand allows me to be creative in the moment, to change my plans on the fly. Basically, I'm ready for almost any situation that's possible, and yet there are situations that happen that I have to adjust my plan in the moment. And that's totally okay, because that, in my opinion, is what makes it really, really interesting. I also find that every moment that I needed to look at my notes to remember what was coming next was a moment that I didn't see my students in real time. It was another moment that I didn't see what was happening in the class at that particular moment on that particular day. And I felt it was important for me to train myself to be better at that, to observe my students all the time, to see what's happening in their body, to see the energetics of the room, and then if I needed to modify in any way, I was able to. So, those are my tips if you're thinking about ditching those notes while you're teaching your class sequence. And again, either way works, but if you are thinking about it, I just want to reinforce this idea that you have the ability to do it. You have great training, you're intuitive, you have the knowledge and the wisdom, you're a yoga teacher, you have observation skills, you just have to practice at it just like anything else. Your notes aren't going to suddenly disappear unless you put them aside and teach on the fly, but be well prepared. Let's not forget that. All right. Let me know what you think. If you try any of these tips out, pop a comment in the box below, and I'll see you on the mat again next time.